And let's get started. So Danny, you are not completely new to SIG Docs at this point, but you're new to this meeting. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and add anything to the agenda that you'd like in perpetuity?
Right. So yeah, my name is Danny. First time on anything related to Cube in terms of any SIGs. However, coming from the OpenShift world, where I'm part of the CentOS Pass SIG, which basically deliver all the OpenShift RPMs to CentOS reports. So that's me basically, and hopefully I can help out a bit with the docs.
Thanks, Danny, and welcome.
Cheers. Thank you.
I have added a few updates and reminders to the agenda also. Zach is out today and tomorrow, so I'm not sure, since he had a question originally in the agenda about PR wrangling, I will do something about PR wrangling for the next couple of days. Making no promises about quantity, but make sure I'm at least staying on top of the queue, and then check in with him when he gets back. Unless anybody else has information that suggests that what's on the PR Wrangler page isn't up to date. Sometimes it's gotten a little out of whack a couple of times. Does anybody else know that they happen to be up for it this week? Okay, then we've got that one covered. Some of you know I'm an organizer of Write the Docs for the Portland, Oregon conference. So since I know some of the folks in this group have attended in the past and might be interested in attending this year, I thought I'd let y'all know the speakers are announced and tickets are going fast. If previous years are anything to go by, they'll sell out in less than a month from now. And the conference is May 19th to 21st. So that's coming up frighteningly fast. And yes, it does in fact conflict with KubeCon Barcelona, which may mean it's not an option for folks who have been able to attend KubeCon Europe and Write the Docs in the past. But I know that some folks are opting for the US side of things that week. So I figured I would let y'all know. And because we had my model in announcing the time of this meeting in the Slack channel, I realized that it was probably useful to remind folks who were not in the US on this call that we will be we'll have different time differences starting next week because the US goes on daylight savings time this coming weekend. And until I have to, I don't try to stay on top of which parts of the world go on daylight time or change time zones, you know, at different times, and which ones stay the same time zone year round. So we'll get that sorted, but I will update the agenda for next week with the changed time difference relative to UTC. So let's see, and Zach Arnold can't attend, but he would like to remind everyone in this meeting that he's got a form up for anybody interested in participating in the SIG Docs security working group. And it's not a commitment form. I've taken a look at it already. If any of you hasn't had a chance, the link is there in the agenda. It was in Slack yesterday. It went out to I believe it went out to the Google group also. It's just a logistical thing. Who are you and when can you meet and what kinds of things about the security docs might you be interested in working on? So Zach is busy wrangling that, for which we give him great thanks. Does anybody else have any updates, reminders, announcements for the group? Okay, we have a light agenda so far, unless folks are in the process of adding to it. But Dominic, it seems that you would like to talk some more about Kubernetes and whether it's really a part of system.
Good morning. Hi, everybody.
Oh, sorry.
Hello. Hi. Hi, everybody. This is Suresh, and I just joined by phone from Dubai.
Ah, what time is it there?
Here it's 10:30 p.m.
Well, welcome. Are you you're new to the group?
Yeah, thank you very much. This is my first call, so I'm joining for the first time. So I'm pretty much new.
Okay. Do you have access to the agenda?
Yes, the SIG meeting notes.
Yes. If you could add your name
Yes,
to the list, because I don't want to misspell it, and I don't trust my ability to hear it.
Could you see this? I just typed.
Oh, Andrew, have you got it?
Pardon?
Yeah, I was going to type it in if he was going to tell it to us.
Ah, got it.
You said Suresh?
Yes, Suresh Kumar Paraman. I just added to the Docs SIG meeting notes, like new contributors. Or let me add here.
Got it. Thank you.
Yes.
Much easier. I could add Danny's name only because I could actually see it in the window of the Zoom meeting. Welcome. Do you want?
No, unfortunately.
Suresh,
Yes.
do you want to introduce yourself to the group?
Yes, please.
Tell us a little bit about your interest in the Kubernetes docs.
Sure. We have started exploring Kubernetes for our, for our teams, and as well as we are ICT providers here in Dubai. So we are also providing. We also want to provide Kubernetes as a service. So we are exploring a couple of options like GKE Beta and VMware PKS. So yeah, we also have some teams who are developing machine learning as a service. So essentially, they are leveraging Seldon machine learning model deployments and Kubeflow. I have helped my team to deploy Seldon and Kubeflow for some time. So we are in touch with Weave actually to build the clusters, enterprise-grade clusters. And I'm also writing TKA on this 21st. Hope I get through.
Great. Well, welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
I think, do we have any other folks who joined a little late? I think not. My apologies, Suresh, for not catching you before, and my apologies, Dominic, for getting this stuff a bit out of order, but we're back on track, I think.
Not a problem.
Do you want to talk about Kubernetes as a declarative system with a question mark?
Sure. So please,
Do you want,
right now I can't share my screen because it's already being shared.
so, but if you want to share, I will unshare.
Awesome, thank you. All right, let's try this again. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Unfortunately, I'm not able to see my screen see your screen. I'm not able to join Zoom. I'm not sure why. So I have joined by phone. I can only hear.
Okay, in that case, this will actually be a little hard for you to follow, but if you're interested in this little brain teaser, then I think you can catch the recording later on YouTube.
Actually, I can put a link
Okay.
to it in the notes, and then he can look at the slides.
Yeah, I was going to suggest.
Okay.
Oh yeah, duh.
Yeah, or put a link to the slides in the agenda. That would be helpful too, I think.
All right, clever. So then, please, ladies and gentlemen, follow me along on a little brain teaser. And it's called the Kubernetes Robot Arena. And for this, we have an arena with 4 different little robots that can pick up objects of a certain color and drop off objects of a certain color. So, and you see the algorithm for each robot on the robot itself. So the one on the left, for example, is going to pick up the gray ball and is going to drop the orange ball. And if you wonder what that has to do with Kubernetes, we will definitely get to that. So I guess it is fairly easy to actually anticipate what is going to happen, but let's run through this real quick. So this robot is going to grab the gray one, drop the orange one. The robot on the top grabs the orange one and drops the blue one. The robot on the right grabs the blue one and drops a purple, I guess, purple one. And the robot on the bottom grabs the purple one and drops the green one. So far, so good. That was not very hard. However, my question would be, how do you describe this system? Would you say it is imperative? Would you say it is declarative? Would you say none of these descriptions make sense in this context? And what description would you choose for that? You guys want to participate? I'm more than happy about it.
Well, I wouldn't call it declarative because nowhere did someone declare that we want a green ball.
Oh my God, wonderful. Thank you. You made my point better than I could have ever made it. Yeah. If you think about this, right, the reason why this is on here is that this very accurately reflects the workings of Kubernetes. Let's go back to the start. Instead of a gray ball, I have a deployment in the Kubernetes object store. The deployment controller reads off the deployment and creates a replica set. The replica set controller reads the replica set and creates a pod. And the kubelet picks up on the pod and creates a container. So when we describe Kubernetes as a declarative system, we usually say that we specify the desired state. We say that the deployment, the desired state of the deployment is to have a set number of pods. But as you just said, that would actually mean the gray ball is a specification of the desired state for a green ball. And that is just odd. I don't want to say if it's wrong. Maybe you can view the world through this lens, but it is completely odd. It does not spark a very good mental picture if I tell anybody green ball stands for I want, gray ball stands for I want a green ball. Right? Yet the deployment is usually explained like it stands for I want a set of pods. It doesn't make or it makes as much sense as saying that the gray ball stands for I want the green ball. Now, let's take this just one step further to actually internalize how this system works, right? So far, we've seen these are individual actors, right? They can do like their own thing. And they are causally coupled. Just because the one guy drops an orange ball, the other guy can pick it up and drop a blue ball. I can reason about this, right? I can what has to happen in what order. So individual agents causally coupled. All right. Let's take a different setup. We have an orange ball. Guy on the top picks up the blue ball. Guy on the right picks up the blue ball, drops the purple ball. The guy on the bottom picks up the purple ball, drops an orange ball and a red ball. And the guy on the left, greedy guy, just grabs the red ball, doesn't grab nothing. Doesn't drop nothing. All
so
right.
I have a question about the rules of the game here.
Yes.
Do you only get to drop when it's your turn to pick, or can you drop anytime?
Very good question. No, you can only drop when it's your turn to pick.
Okay.
Very good question. Thank you. I actually did not think about introducing the rules of the game like that. So we're not going to go through this all again, but we are now at a point where the robot on the bottom dropped off an orange one and a red one. What is going to happen next?
So that depends on whether in the system, like they're coordinated or not, or they just kind of act independently.
They act independently.
So then there are two possibilities. Either the robot on the left picks up the red ball, or the robot on the top picks up the orange ball, but you don't necessarily know for sure which one will go in which order.
Correct. And you need to remember that this is not just a question between the one on the bottom and the one on the left, right? It is also now a question between the one on the top and then eventually the one on the right. So nobody says that the red one needs to go in there at any point in time. If we do this round 5 times, I could end up with 5 red balls and 1 orange ball over here before the red one ever picks one up. And then it could pick up 5 red ones in a row. Right? So, and you already said the point. They are not coordinated. So, Kubernetes is accurately described as a system of individual actors that are causally but not temporarily connected. They can act whenever they want to act, when their preconditions, as Steve mentioned, when their preconditions are enabled. That is the overall working philosophy of Kubernetes. And that accurately describes Kubernetes. This is how the robot is a stand-in for the individual controllers, and the objects, the colored objects, is a stand-in for the individual Kubernetes objects and kinds of Kubernetes objects. Yet I believe none of us would think that this is a declarative system. We wouldn't jump to that description. And none of us would say that a object, the colored object, is a specification that I want another colored object. In fact, I want to take it one step further. The colored object itself doesn't carry any semantics whatsoever. There is just an orange ball on the floor. That doesn't mean anything. It only means something to one specific robot. That's the one that gives it the semantic. So I would argue that a deployment cannot stand for a specification of the desire to have a set of pods or a set of containers. Yet, I do not have a crisp, concise term that describes this system. In control system literature, as far as I can tell, the general interplay between the components is called a coupling, but that is as far as I saw it on like standard nomenclature. But if we describe this interaction in the documentation well, the mechanics of this, if we describe this well, we have an overall description of how Kubernetes works. And it is accurate. It is free of philosophy or wishful thinking. It is a description of how Kubernetes is constructed.
But I think Brad Topol is on, right? Because Brad, I'd love to hear from you because I know you've described Kubernetes as sort of a declarative system. So I'm kind of interested in terms of like kind of your thoughts on that and why it's common that people like to describe Kubernetes that way.
Well, I think they like to describe it as a declarative system is because of the YAMLs, right? So the YAMLs are the piece that you've got a specification and that's the state and you shove it into the system and it does its very best to make that desired state become the actual state. So that's why that's where it comes from my point. Now, I mean, things happening underneath, right? I mean, so if you got 6 replicas and 2 go down and your desired state is to have 6, it's going to start 2 more up. You declared what you wanted and it's going to go make it happen. That's why I always do it. Does that help, Andrew?
Yeah, because see, when we were looking at this, like we tried to make the declarative thing work for a while, but we ran into like problems as we got into certain areas. Like one other example, Dominic, correct me if I'm wrong, but is like just looking at pods, right? And like say you want to run an application that's just continuously running versus a job which you want to run to completion, right? So like when you're trying to think of like being declarative specifically, you never really state that in the YAML file, whether you want the pod to run to completion or to just keep running, right? But depending on which thing you're doing in which context, it may be different. So it's like, how do you then, when you're really trying to strictly define declarative, like what does that mean in that context? Because it totally depends.
No, I agree with you. You've got to be careful. I mean, the declarative model works really well for deployments and replica sets, but when you talk about jobs, that's more there's either an implied declarative notion or you just know how the job works, right? It runs until it's done. So I see what you're saying. I never really thought about it in that context, Andrew, but you're right. It's not. Certain aspects of it map very well to being declarative. And then the other thing is there's just lots of other mechanisms and constructs that there's not as much declarativeness showing through, if that makes sense. So yeah, I think, it's kind of like if you dig into too many details, the analogy kind of breaks down. I would have to agree with you there.
Yeah, because that's the problem we ran into. It's like in some areas it kind of makes sense and it's easy to think about things that way, but then we couldn't stretch it to make it consistent across the whole system.
Yes.
Yeah, and then there's the whole model of people not necessarily using the declarative portion. They're running from the command line. They're actually doing the more procedural piece, the more imperative piece, right? Go create this, create that, right? So in that case, the declarative was only was the desired path, but not the only path, right?
Right. So then the question is then how do we talk about Kubernetes? Because this terminology has already been kind of like used by the community a lot. So what do we do? Like, you know, especially with respect to the documentation.
Well, I mean, aren't we able to put constraints around when we're declaring pieces? Oh wow. When we're saying certain pieces are subscribing to the declarative model, and then de-emphasize that piece when we talk about pieces of Kubernetes that aren't as much in that area.
Sure, but we could also be more radical. Maybe, like, what if we just didn't use that terminology at all? Like, I'm not saying that's what we should do, but like, you know, like that's one extreme too. Like, we could just drop that from the documentation altogether. But like, I just want to kind of just see what people think.
But I think what's going to make you want to have it stick around is that whole, you look at those YAML specs and you know, if you're giving a specification of a model, it's real hard to not call that declarative, if that makes sense. So at least for the YAML pieces that have the spec and the status and trying to achieve a desired state, I think you're going to have a hard time not calling that piece of it declarative.
I wonder too whether I mean, I think this is a great discussion, but I wonder whether maybe the way to approach it in the documentation, and this is a variation on what Brad's been saying, I think, but trying to get a little bit more precise about it, you know, putting the right frame around the term declarative. And I'm not suggesting that we go back to the old organizational model of user guide and admin guide, but from the perspective of someone whose interaction with Kubernetes is to get a deployment up there and running, not to configure all of the details of the cluster, or to understand what the implications of all those configurations are, but simply to get that YAML specification appropriately written and appropriately deployed, another one of those overloaded terms. That's the case where the interaction with Kubernetes really seems to be appropriately called declarative. And I agree with Brad, I don't think we want to get rid of it. When we start looking at how things work under the hood and we start looking at all of the sort of varieties of Kubernetes objects, then yes, things get complicated and declarative doesn't work anymore. But that's not, people who need to understand Kubernetes at that level are not all of our audience for the docs. I guess I'd want us to remember that too, right?
Right.
Does that make sense? Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah.
You know, we've talked about personas, and I'm not suggesting we go back to, I mean, in the past with sort of past projects on the docs, and I'm not suggesting we go back and start trying to build up more personas that were kind of artificial constructs when we worked on them anyway. But if we do think about the different needs of different users who come to the Kubernetes docs, I think we can find an appropriate place for the term declarative without smearing it all over everything.
Yeah.
So, Dominic, I think to sell this idea of that maybe declarative isn't the right word, I think maybe help us understand why you would argue that even in a replica set or a deployment, you don't view that as a user declaring a desired state.
Of course. So first, the observation that we made in the beginning, right? Where we say, well, the green ball is not the declaration of the desired state. Oh, I'm sorry, the gray ball is not the declaration of the desired state green ball, right? That is a very accurate description of what happens in Kubernetes.
So let's pause on that for a minute. If that gray ball is a deployment manifest, why does that not express the user's desire that there be eventually these 3 containers running?
So in that case, you would say, to stick with the example, we could look at the gray ball as a specification that we want a green ball. Okay, you could do that. Number one, it does not seem natural, right? None of us jumped onto this. So it seems now we're trying to force a mental model that doesn't come natural to us when we talk about the robots and the colorful objects. Right? That is number one. So the mental model doesn't seem very suitable, right? Doesn't come natural. So that is the first part. The second part is another interesting one, actually. Now, what does the gray ball stand for? Now it stands for I want a blue ball. It's an interesting observation as well, right? Because by taking out the robot, I broke the chain. Now all I can say is, well, if I have a gray ball to begin with, eventually I have a blue ball. Never gonna get the green ball. However, the gray ball didn't change. Right? The gray ball is still the gray ball. Oops. Oh, come back. Ah, here we go. Now the gray ball stands for the green ball again. It's also an interesting observation. The next point that I would want to make is that personally, I have the tendency to try to describe a system in terms of its construction, right? In terms of the sheer facts. The system is constructed a certain way. A system behaves a certain way. There is no argument about it. It's just universally true. Right? I understand that certain analogies, right, from a high enough level, and if we only look, like, we don't look close enough on the replica, on the deployment, and we only look at the deployment, we completely ignore the jobs, and then, yeah, you can have a mental model of declarative. But it breaks down as soon as you look at other aspects of the system, and it breaks down if you look into detail, right? That doesn't seem to be a suitable mental model either. It doesn't hold when you look at the entirety or the individual components of Kubernetes, and it doesn't hold when you look into detail. However, if we find a good description of the robot process, right, that one holds. It doesn't matter what components, aka controllers, you look at. It doesn't matter in how much detail you look at it. That mental model will hold. So you do not have to have multiple mental models that are inspired more by philosophy or what we want, right? You have one mental model, and that is how the system is actually constructed. And the system follows this model everywhere. So it's actually fairly easy to describe, right? Every controller can be described in these terms.
Well, what terms? When you say every controller can be described in these terms, what exactly are the terms?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have something that rolls off the tongue. But let me try here. Yeah, these are individual actors. They are causally coupled. They're not temporally coupled, and an actor acts according to. If an action is continuously enabled, that action will eventually be taken. As I said, this doesn't roll off the tongue. Yeah, somebody should actually find something more snappy for that.
Yeah.
But it is an accurate description of the system as a whole and the individual parts of them.
Yeah, I think the challenge you're going to have is, you know, all models can only model so much, and they all eventually break down against a real system. There's always going to be things where I just think the model just can't capture everything. And, you know,
the decision for the declarative and you know, using the declarative analogy or the declarative description is because it was a key differentiator for Kubernetes compared to previous cloud infrastructures. So if you looked at what we did in previous cloud infrastructures, whether it was CloudStack or OpenStack, these were very procedural based approaches. You use scripts to deploy. So you used Chef or Puppet or Ansible. And the beauty of Kubernetes with its YAML description, the YAML files and the ability to generate Docker files was it was at least more declarative than the previous generation, which meant we could store and source control all your YAML files. We could store and source control all the Docker files used to generate the images. And we had a much better view of the world with regards to being able to keep it in source control and do continuous delivery. And so for those types of reasons, that's why many of us view Kubernetes as more declarative than the previous procedural scripting-based cloud infrastructures. And you're going to have a hard time getting people not to want to use that term, especially with the specification state model built into so many things. Does the model eventually break down if you dig too deep? Absolutely. But does the model get most users where they need to be and understanding the value of Kubernetes and how it differentiates from previous cloud infrastructures? It does a pretty good job. So, I mean, you know, that's the trade-off. Is the 80% model, say, of using a declarative model, let's call it the 80% solution where it's getting you 80%, is that good enough and is that right? Because what can happen, you know, as I was taught many years ago, well, we want the 100% solution, but the truth is we'll just program it wrong anyway. And you know, you know, so that's why the 80% is a lot easier to accept and deliver.
I have one follow-up statement on that. From the beginning, when you said all models break down, that depends. So there are two types of, or multiple, but two in this case. There are models of analogies, and that is correct. Not everything that is true about the model is true about the system. These models break down.
Sure.
But there are models about models of construction, where everything that is true about the model is true about the system. They do not break down. They just refine. They add. And right. I think we identified like a key question in the philosophy of the documentation. And Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong. This is more your field. The question is, do we want to lie to children? Andrew, is that right in that case?
Yeah. So there's you can look up on Wikipedia, but there's this way of explaining things. It's called lying to children, where you tell them like a simplified thing just so that they have some way to think about it. And then later on, you're like, well, actually, no, it's not like that. It's actually this. And sometimes in universities, they do that too. You know, sure. But that's not the approach that we want to take.
There is one reason to, or at least for me, there's one reason to avoid this approach. And that is, so psychologists define mental model, right, as an internal representation of the concepts and the relations among the concepts that concern us. And one of the problems with mental models is that is a deeply held belief, right? So once you acquire a mental model, it is very hard in general to shed that mental model. So when you have that lying to children approach, right, and you need to go further, eventually you come to the point where you struggle and you will run into frustration, right? Because you have to shed what you believed you knew about the system. But it's a question of philosophy. So that would basically be it, right? Does the documentation want to lie to children or not?
Well, if you constrain it to the notion of where we're saying it really does apply, deployments, replica sets, et cetera, I don't think you're lying to children. I mean, to the best of my understanding, you are feeding in a specification, and Kubernetes is going to do its best to meet that desired state as declared in the specification. Now, there may be other areas where we'll just have to declare that we're not going to heavily try and use the declarative model to describe something like jobs or whatever, and that's fine. I mean, you just start out with a different description, and the declarative notion of it isn't as heavy, although there may be still a little bit in there. I'd have to go revisit it, but I mean, I want to be careful. I mean, I don't view the declarative as necessarily, if properly constrained, lying to children, as far as I understand. I don't know, Steve or Jennifer? Go ahead.
Well, I'm inclined to agree with you, Brad, but I think that at a higher level, I have 2 points to make. One is we need to wind this discussion down, because I would like us to hear from Jim Angel about the state of the 114 docs, and we're coming up on the end of the meeting, and this is getting very big and very conceptual and theoretical. But the other thing that I'm hearing us lose sight of, that I tried to call attention to earlier, but I'll be more explicit here, is we're talking about a theoretically pure construct for an ideally typed audience. And in fact, we are writing for real people who need to do real things with a real system. Yeah. And I'd like to invite us to not forget that fact, that Kubernetes is a tool that people use. And while I think this does not mean that I think that we should turn away from finding a better, more sort of internally consistent way of describing the entire system, people who need that kind of information are, I'm guessing, probably a relatively small subset of the folks who come to the Kubernetes docs looking for solutions to problems of how to get their app up and running, stable and extensible. At the end of the day, that's who we're writing for, I believe. We're maybe writing for other people as well, but this conversation is leaving the kind of practical application audience aside, I think. And while I'd like, maybe if we think about that audience more, that'll help us find answers to some of the questions that Dominic is raising in a more sort of practical way too. I realize that's also a very theoretical construct, what I just said.
No, and if I could add to that, I agree with everything you said, Jennifer. And the other way to look at it is, even if you could get everything right with a model, and you're like, I've nailed it 100% with this model, you have to understand and accept that a lot of the people that read the documentation are not necessarily model oriented. I like models because I took a heck of a lot of abstract math on my journey in my education, so I personally enjoy it. And the syntax, the semantics, they really, I really find joy in reading things that way. But I have to admit, there's a lot of people that are trying to use Kubernetes that the model approach is not going to be something that they digest very well. So I think that kind of complements what you said, Jennifer.
Right. Although I think that, Andrew and Dominic both have done some tremendous work in sort of unpacking things that help folks understand how to do stuff more clearly and coherently, and especially how to troubleshoot by understanding what's going on under the hood better. Yeah. And I'm not saying that should be I'm not trying to give direction here. I see real value here, but I'm trying it sort of at all levels, but I'm trying to bring it back to the sort of practical aspects of the docs. And I guess I'm also wondering, because I'm trying to shut myself up at this point, whether maybe, I don't know whether it's possible to take some of this conversation to Slack, whether those of us who are interested should form a smaller working group, because we've taken up, I think, a lot of, I mean, I think we've done I think this has been a really, really useful and important conversation. We clearly can't dedicate this kind of time out of the weekly SIG Docs meeting to this kind of discussion going forward, but I think it's really important. So maybe we could brainstorm in Slack a little bit about how to continue the conversation in a sort of a side group, a working group, asynchronously? I'm not sure.
Yeah, the working group already exists. It's the fundamental modeling working group, and the meetings are Friday at what, Andrew?
10 a.m. Pacific.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, that one's just fallen off. Whoop, that one's fallen off my calendar. My bad. I'll get it back. I'll also add it to the agenda. And with that, I'm real sorry to be what feels like arbitrary here, but let's bring this conversation to a close and hear from Jim about 114.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. Let me share up my screen here if you don't mind. All right, can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
Cool. All right, so this is the enhancement tracking spreadsheet. I'm not sure who all has seen it or not. I added a link in the agenda here. And what I wanted to go over is I made a few changes in how we're tracking some of the enhancements to give us better real-time metrics. And just a quick, too long didn't read overview of the release process for documentation is mainly these two columns here. So this is a list of all the enhancements for 114. They made it a requirement that every single enhancement had to have a community enhancement proposal. So that's a very cool forcing function that then requires all of these enhancements to have a testing plan, a rollback plan, a update plan, essentially a group of people all agreeing that this is an enhancement that's needed and should be going into Kubernetes or whatever the latest release is, and this documentation tracks it. What we also do for SIG Docs is track it under these two columns is, does this enhancement need docs? So there's options of whether it has docs, needs docs, they're unknown, or there's none required. And then beyond the does it need it just in general, there's the actual doc status. So this is more of the real-time tracking of what docs are going through their overall life cycle or how they're changing. So here for the status, we have, draft. So it means there's a PR open, it's in draft state, it's not ready to be merged, it's not implementable, it is just in kind of a raw form, almost like a placeholder PR that's just out there. No PR could be good or bad depending on the status that's right before it. So if you see below here, you'll see none required has no PR. So that makes sense. Late would be if you needed docs and you didn't have any PRs open for those docs and you missed a deadline. And you can see it kind of goes through here, has a PR open, it's ready for review, it's complete or merged. So the reason for doing this and why I'm going through explaining this is I was able to modify the overview for the feature stats, an additional tab here to give a point in time view of where we're at for the documentation. So what I felt was lacking in this release cycle is the ability to say, yeah, we're 60% good or we're 80% good. I didn't feel like I had that the ability. So here what I did is I started pinning it down to see, okay, so in this release, there's a total of 33 enhancements. And I can check that against some of these other metrics here. So I can see here's the total of alpha, beta, and stable releases, there's 33 there. I can also see that there's features per SIG, there's 33 there. So those numbers all make sense. And then I can see, okay, well, I need 22 documents in the current release. One of them is unknown, 10 don't require docs. So what is the overall picture if we zoom into that? And then looking here, we can see that there's 4 that are complete, that are actually merged into the Dev 114 branch. We can see there's 9 that are ready to review, 8 in draft, and then 1 that's late. So it gives us kind of a holistic view here. And I think having draft as yellow is not entirely accurate. I think it could be a yellowish green almost when we see this. So I think overall we're looking very good. We're very healthy, looking about 90% as far as docs in the right direction. We'd like to see more of these docs in draft go more for the ready or change into more ready for review. But, we have until Monday. I should not that long of a time frame. We have essentially till this upcoming Monday to have everything in the ready to review. So a total of 9 docs there. So that's kind of what I've been working on the past couple of days, getting this snapshot view, which I think is going to be very helpful for as we started to do the release burn down, knowing exactly where we're at, and hopefully alleviate some of the craziness that happens as we get closer to the release. And that's essentially where we're at. I don't know if anyone has any questions on this.
This is awesome, Jim.
Yeah, very nice.
Having this kind of sort of status update. Is there anything that the SIG can help with in terms of moving things along this week, since you're getting down to the wire here?
Yeah, so I think between us and the shadows, we should have enough, people looking at the different issues. But I guess as we're reviewing different PRs and seeing things come in, if you see anything that looks like it might be for the release, it's improperly marked, improperly tagged, any open questions, feel free to ping me on Slack or any of the shadows you're involved with the SIG release for docs. So I guess I'm saying we don't need help, but we need all the help. So
Well,
if you see anything, just holler.
I'm not sure whether you were in the meeting at the beginning, Jim. I'm picking up PR wrangling just today and tomorrow because Zach is out and he's on the list for this week. So I'll make a point of checking because I know sometimes things do wind up in the wrong branch. That's probably the thing that I have contributed the most to in any given release cycle when I haven't been officially on the release team. I mean, I know a lot of other folks have too. So
Right.
Sort of reminder if anybody's in there, extra eyes on those issues. Is this really a PR for the master branch? Should it ship now, or does this look like a new feature?
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm never sure whether this meeting is supposed to end at 2:20 or 2:30, but we're hitting it right about in the middle. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to bring up in the last either overtime minute or 6 minutes?
Just if you are signed up to do one of the projects, we have in the Git repo, we have the projects you can go to, doc writing and editing, and I can see that people have signed up for most of those, I think, and there is some progress being made. Maybe next week we can, at our meeting, we can go through and just ask, one project at a time, what's the status of this? Or one issue at a time.
Steve, sorry, what are these projects?
So like the one you worked on for replica set, those work items.
Oh, there's a page filled with them?
I will add this to the agenda. I'll make a note that we'll put it, I'll make it a note for this week's agenda that we'll put it on next week's agenda and add the link to the project. You mean the GitHub projects, right, Steve?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
GitHub project.
Okay, so it's somewhere around here.
Okay, anything else? Okay, in the immortal words of our absent leader, that's a SIG meeting. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.